Good evening, and thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Carbonetta, and this is Arroyo Live. This program, which is produced by and through the facilities of Pasadena Media, was created with an idea to help inform and restore a sense of both connection and understanding to those experiencing many of the negative effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. More recent events have helped to underscore the need for a more compassionate, more considerate approach to every aspect, every person in our society. And so it remains the continued focus of this program to try to help bring together and strengthen our community through informative and meaningful conversation. This program is live if you are watching on Tuesday, September 15th, and there will be an opportunity for you to call in with your questions or comments later on in the program. You can share them with us anytime at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. Law and order are a part of the very fabric of our society and an important part of our community. Those who choose to take up the mantle of law enforcement face an ever-changing landscape and an ever-increasing scope of responsibilities. Today, across the U.S., there are more than 18,000 local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies employing a combined total of more than 420,000 officers. Yet that averages out to little more than 2.2 officers for every 1,000 individuals across the country. This evening, we look at how COVID and the recent social protests are affecting policing. I'm joined by several members of the Pasadena Police Department: Chief John Perez, Deputy Chief Cheryl Moody, Commanders Jason Clausen, Mark Goodman, and Arthur Shute, Acting Executive Administrator Michelle Robinson, and Lieutenant Bill Grisafe. Thank you all for joining me this evening. I apologize if I've mispronounced anybody's names. And understandably, because of ongoing investigations, there may be some questions that you are unable to answer. But again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I guess we'll get right into the program. Ordinarily, we have everybody take a moment to introduce themselves, but there are quite a number of you this evening, so we're going to skip that part of the show and move right on to the obvious question of the evening, which is, do you all know why I've stopped you this evening? And of course, that's just a joke. I apologize for the bad humor. But moving right along, the first question I'd like to pose to each of you is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected policing?
I'll let my staff begin. I could answer at the end. The deputy chief could start first, and then we'll go to Commander Clausen and anybody else who wants to speak from there.
Well, speaking on a personal level, the COVID-19 caused me to gain 19 pounds from being sequestered at home. But I do go to work, as I guess I'm considered an essential employee. But, you know, it's had a tremendous impact on law enforcement in that we have to be, the officers have to be very cautious when they're responding to calls. They have to wear their PPE, which is totally different from how they've been, you know, working up to now, up into the COVID virus. So we've had to adjust. Law enforcement has had to adjust as far as the calls for service. Routine calls such as medical events that were occurring in, medical incidents that are occurring in convalescent homes and assisted living homes now require more stringent precautions. So we've had to adjust, just like the rest of the communities had to adjust to COVID.
And I was wondering if anyone else had anything they'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I'll speak. Commander Clausen. I think that, you know, officer safety is always paramount on everything we do, and COVID-19 just, you know, caused that extra level of caution. We have changed our practices here in the department, but we've also changed our practices in the field. Something simple as our forensic technicians don't take photographs at certain crime scenes anymore, where the officers may. So it may be unnecessary to get more personnel out to conduct investigations. and it may be something that just one officer who is in full PPE attire or personal protective equipment can go and handle whatever needs to be handled in an investigation, contacting people, detaining somebody, taking somebody, or talking to somebody at the hospital, or like the deputy chief said, in a facility, a hospital facility. So I think that we always look at the best interest of how we police, but we also got to look at what we are doing when we are policing. And, do we put two people in one car? Do we put one person in the car? And I think that Mark Goodman can talk more about, our protocols internally, how we handle the COVID-19 outbreak and what we're doing inside to protect our employees.
Thanks, Jason. So early on in March of this year, when the COVID pandemic hit the United States, we were tasked with having to develop not only external procedures for our field personnel, but also internal procedures for our personnel, both inside the police station, inside of our city jail, inside of our forensics unit, detectives. Every possible section inside of the department was impacted in some way by COVID-19. And so we've set up a very extensive and revolutionary, I should say, system or approach towards developing our internal contact tracing, I guess, for lack of a better term. It's unprecedented. It's something we've never done before. So we had to implement internal procedures by which we're able to track possible COVID-19 cases and then develop protocols internally based on science in collaboration with our health department and our fire department to make sure we're keeping our personnel safe inside the building and also members of the public safe. So a pretty formidable challenge, but I think we've done a pretty amazing job. We've only had 2 positive cases within the police department since the pandemic struck, and I credit that to our personnel. Our personnel are doing a great job using their personal protective equipment and in informing us and each other when they think there's a possible exposure. So that's been a tremendous help to us.
And to close out this question, what I'll add really quick is at the beginning, we partnered with our fire department, our health department. We're fortunate that we're one of 3 cities in the state of California with 492 cities that we have our own health department. So we were, guided by Dr. Go and her staff, as well as Chief Readers and his staff. And so we early on under the leadership of Steve Mermel, we had emergency operations center meetings almost daily. The staff here met daily. We went through 100 different work areas and responsibilities within the department, and we made adjustments. Every day we would meet to see what those adjustments were, and we would constantly update them. And so we made all these changes early in March. It's paid off to this date. As Mark Goodman had said, we're fortunate for our people. They grabbed it, they learned it. We put out protocols that change often. We've probably handled somewhere around 70,000 calls for service since the global pandemic broke out, and we've only had 2 positive returns for COVID. So our people have done a fantastic job. There has been challenges. We have stopped our internal training. We've stopped our ability to communicate with the community as we usually do. We had to find new ways of continuing policing services and the calls for service with that.
All right. Well, certainly as recent events have demonstrated, the job of policing is inherently dangerous and requires a lot of personal protective gear every day. How has COVID made the job more difficult? Has having to wear additional PPE related to the pandemic caused even greater hardships for officers in the field?
Yes, I'll let Commander Shute answer that one as he oversees our patrol division.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges for us is not only adapting to responding to COVID, but also making sure that our officers are trained appropriately, not only for us and our safety, but for the community's safety as well. We don't want to expose the community to anything we may bring to an incident, as we don't want to be exposed to anything that may be at an incident. So it's a matter of just teaching the officers and training the officers and making sure that they're using their protective equipment and making sure that when we engage the community's protecting themselves as well, and that we're maintaining that social distancing and handling calls appropriately, that nobody's exposed. So it's the training portion and getting people accustomed to a new way of policing. This may not go away for a long time, and as we adapt and as everybody in the United States adapts to this virus and epidemic, or pandemic, I should say, we're adapting with it as well, and we're progressing. So it's a lot of training.
And to add to that answer that the commander provided, we've had to prepare for emergencies internally. We've had areas that were potentially exposed to COVID, and we've had to be careful about closing down our dispatch center or our jail. The dispatch center takes on 1,200 phone calls a day. You could imagine having to clear out that area and not having dispatchers or a report writing room. And we've had dozens and dozens of personnel placed on quarantine or isolation to ensure their safety. And by doing that early and doing our own, trace contacts internally to see who else might have been exposed, we've reduced our exposures when somebody did come back with a positive hit on COVID. So there were challenges for us to be able to walk into areas and, clean it up as soon as we had a potential exposure, so the area could be reused again within 24 hours. So that's been a challenge for us, but we've kept on with our constant services because of this whole command staff's approach. And again, with our partnerships and all the personnel within the department of nearly 400 people that have in fact come together to understand the urgency in all this.
One thing to add for me is, we practice our critical decision making. Every incident, you don't know what you're going to get. You don't know what to expect. So you need to problem solve daily. When you go out into the field, our officers have to be trained. We may face an active shooter, God forbid. And what are our protocols? What are our plans? And we train for this accordingly. And this pandemic is just one other obstacle that we will beat. Look at all the things that are occurring: earthquakes, fires, windstorms. This is the stuff that we train every day, but in public safety in general, both police and fire, to problem solve and make sure that the citizens are protected, and yet personnel internally are also protected and well trained to handle these incidents. You don't want untrained people out into the field.
I'd also like for Administrator Robertson or Executive Administrator Robertson to talk a little bit about how the calls for service increased at the onset of COVID-19, where people were calling in about social distancing and people not wearing masks in the community, and how that increased our calls for service. Michelle?
Yeah, our calls for service increased tremendously. There was a lot of unknown, especially in the beginning of COVID. People were concerned about groups of people, not masked up in the parks. And so we received a lot of calls for service for us to respond to locations, like the parks, to address people not social distancing, especially in the beginning of COVID. And so it put a strain on not only the dispatchers, but our officers who had to respond out to those calls for service. And it actually took us away from other calls that needed to be handled in the city. So it was a tremendous hill to climb and to adjust to those additional calls.
All right. Well, Commander Clausen, to go back to something that you just mentioned in your response, you talked about training for other disasters such as fires. So now, as if the global pandemic wasn't difficult enough to have to deal with, we have recently here in the state of California had to deal with a lot of very large and ongoing fires. Of course, the one which is most directly affecting your department right now will be the Bobcat fire. And the current estimates are that they don't expect to have that fire put out until the end of October. And that fire, of course, has brought a lot of problems of its own, not the least of which is very poor air quality. And of course, lots of communities now on standby for evacuation. I'm wondering if you all would talk a little bit about the difficulties that the fires have now brought to.
Sure. Just other than obvious air quality, for the police standard, we get involved usually for traffic mitigation, to make sure that some of these roads that are very windy. I know Glen Oaks is a very windy road, very small, and there's lots of times no parking in these zones when there's like red flag warnings, that we'll go out and we'll try to address some of those issues and or crowd control along with evacuations. If neighborhoods are being threatened by these fires and there's mandatory or voluntary evacuations, when people leave, we then go into the neighborhood to provide like a force protection detail to make sure looters or burglars aren't coming in to try to get into these homes, that especially in a mandatory evacuation zone. So our portion of the public safety is to prevent property crimes from occurring and or God forbid some of the fires start, that we may be in the area to report it and or mitigate that in some way.
And our biggest challenge with the fires is a daily conversation with the fire chief and understanding the planning that goes along with these fires and the potential for evacuations. Trying to evacuate 5, 10, 15, 20,000 people from a neighborhood requires egress and ingress with making sure we have all the right resources. Back in the early 90s, some of us were involved in the Kinaloa fires and the evacuations up there that followed with mudslides in the wintertime. And it was horrendous for us trying to evacuate places like St. Luke's Hospital. We were literally running upstairs and taking the patients out of the hospital and bringing them outside. And it was just a crazy period of time. So we have some of the experience that we would need for the planning. And that is the biggest effort for us to make sure we have our resources identified. And we have to also keep aware of all these fires, of how we're impacted with public safety. We have a percentage of our personnel that might not be able to come into work. And if that happens, we now get reduced by the emergency responders. So even though the winds have been changing, which has been fortunate, we know that any given night, the winds could change again, and we get called at 2 a.m. to start the evacuation process. So it means that we have to be ready at all times for anything with these fires.
And also, I'd like to add in that we have what we call subject matter experts with the police department who are used to working in evacuation, large type event, events that occur in the city, and evacuation in the city will be a large type event, and that will be our Commander Shute. Commander Shute already has a plan laid out. He's worked with the fire department, and there is a plan for the city for evacuation. So I'd like to hear a little bit, if I can get Art Shute to talk about a little bit the evacuation plan.
Thanks, Deputy Chief Moody. Yeah, I have event planning, and part of our job is, and counterterrorism as well. So part of our job is planning for planned and unplanned events. And as the chief mentioned, I talk with fire on a daily basis, fire's command staff, to monitor the fire, see where the fire is at. And we do have plans in place, mutual aid agreements for other police departments to come assist us in the fact that we do have to have evacuations or implement an evacuation plan. We have a plan that's prepared. We're ready for a staging location for police and fire to have a unified command. And then we're also ready for a location for people that have to be evacuated from their homes to go to for safety if they have nowhere else to go. So we have an extensive plan that's already prepared, and we've been working with fire since the fire started. And I'm happy to say, as of right now, as the chief mentioned, unless the winds change, the fire is going over the hill away from us, which is good news for us and the community.
An important part of this, I'll let Lieutenant Grisafi answer this one, about our community connections with our media and the alerts that we have. You could talk a bit about that so people have an understanding how that comes out and how we constantly communicate with our local media.
Yeah, it's imperative on these. Thank you, Chief. It's imperative on these that the messaging gets out to the residents and community members. The fire department has done a exceptional job at getting this information out, and I have daily conversations with Lisa Derderian, the PIO for the fire department and the city, to get the information out by whatever means we have. We use media, we use social media, which is really becoming maybe probably the most important and main source of information that community members are using. And then we also use Nixle reports. So getting that information out is important. How we do it is even more important. And the approach at this point is we don't want people in the community to panic at this point. That's the message now. The message is be prepared. We're not at the point that we need to take any action, but just be prepared. And that's the main message at this point.
All right. This may have become less of an issue as a result of the reduced air quality caused by the fires. But if we can take a step back to COVID for just a brief moment, certainly there have been issues with masks and mandates to wear them and people refusing to wear them. Does the department have a policy when it comes to wearing masks and enforcement of those mandatory mask requirements?
So I'll start with internally, we are mandated to wear them here within the police department. We have meetings, settings. We ensure our masks are on. Sometimes we forget to bring our mask. You have to run back and get it. Or when you speak, you might bring down your mask for a moment. All those little human errors that occur. When it comes to the outside, we do a lot of education and warning for people where we need to. But for the most part, we are not the enforcement arm of the masks. But when needed, we do remind people the importance of it. And I have to tell you, the majority of this city, the people who come in contact, people are listening, people are wearing them, people do care. And so we're seeing a lot of positive outcomes because of that, as we're seeing the COVID start to drop again here around the area.
And just to piggyback a little bit on that, we also require our inmates to wear masks here in the facility. So anytime we have someone in custody, it's important that we are concerned about the health and safety of everyone in custody here, including the jail staff. So we require the inmates to wear their masks as well here.
All right. Well, another unfortunate side effect of the COVID pandemic, certainly in the early phases of identification and the decision that people would be, and I hesitate to use the word sequestered, but that's more or less what it boiled down to. There was a radical decrease in the amount of vehicular traffic as people were able to stay home and work from home, and there were fewer commuters. But again, an unfortunate side effect is that because the roads were left wide open, there seemed to be an increase in speeding. And with that, an increase in traffic accidents in cities across the country. I'm wondering if you've seen that kind of effect in Pasadena and how the department's been dealing with that kind of a situation.
Yes, I'll let Commander Goodman walk into that topic as he oversees our traffic team out in the field.
Thanks, Chief. So yes, you are correct, Joe. Just after the pandemic took full effect and people were asked to stay home, of course, there were still cars out on the road, people going to doctor's appointments and conducting some personal business, etc. We did have some complaints and some concerns about speeding on some of our major thoroughfares, such as Orange Grove, Lake Avenue, Mountain Street, Washington Boulevard, some of our larger streets. So in response to that, we recognize that a lot of people were struggling financially in the wake of not being able to go to work because of the pandemic. So what we did was a two-pronged approach. It was education and then enforcement second, but primarily education. And we positioned our personnel in key areas of the city in order to be most effective and do some traffic stops here or there when we could, when we weren't responding to calls for service, and educate folks about the dangers of speeding, even though it looks perfectly safe because the roads are wide open and we haven't seen this kind of light traffic since I can't remember when. So education first, enforcement second, and targeting specific areas of the city with our resources effectively.
All right. I also want to make mention that during the height of the pandemic, there had been a moratorium on some of the parking restriction enforcements, but I believe that some of that has gone back to normal, as it were. And so it would be great if we could clarify that for our viewers at home. But also, how has traffic been affected by the decision to move dining outdoors? I know that there are sections of Colorado Boulevard, for instance, where lanes have been closed off to make way for seating areas, outdoor dining areas. How has that affected traffic flow within the city?
Yeah, so I'll let, again, Commander Goodman talk about that. And Commander Clausen could talk a bit about the outside dining. It has been a challenge for us. It has created some traffic issues, but overall, it's been a beautiful sight to see people outside eating and helping the restaurants locally. We've been big supporters of that and trying to support many of the business owners. But Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, so at first, when certain sections of Colorado Boulevard were narrowed in order to allow outside dining, it did cause a little bit of traffic congestion at first, but our residents adapted rather quickly to that. And they figured out quite quickly that the sections that were narrowed could be bypassed relatively easily by using Union Street or Green Street to the north or south of Colorado Boulevard. And when I drive Colorado Boulevard, the congestion is minimal now. And it's a great thing to see people out actually in those traffic lanes, enjoying themselves and going to our local businesses and helping to stimulate the economy. So what was originally a bit of an inconvenience has become the new normal. So again, our residents are adapting quickly to the changes that are presented to them.
Jason, you want to talk a little bit about the outside dining and some of the challenges there?
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is the city has a process that evolved regarding temporary sidewalk dining, alley dining, and also the administrative conditional use permit of alcohol sales, as the alcohol beverage control has lifted some of the restrictions about when and where and how alcohol sales are sold to outside patrons outside of the curtilage of the business. So we work with the businesses when we can, when they're submitting conditional use permit applications, because they have to apply through the city to get these restrictions lifted or temporary modifications. So we've been working with them to assist them in every way we can, to include site visits. Sometimes, it's just a quick phone call to us, and we can walk people through, because it's on the city's website through the planning process, on how these businesses can get back into business that were once either sheltered in place or restricted from dining inside. So, there's controls in place that we're working with people to get back up on their feet and open their doors again.
Well, believe it or not, we've reached the halfway point in our program, and this is traditionally when we open up the phone lines to viewers at home that may have a question or comment. If you'd like to call in with your questions or comments, you can do so now. The telephone number is area code 951-356-6882. And again, if you are watching on Tuesday, September 15th, we are live, and we would welcome your questions. Okay.
Joe, I'd like to say real quickly, and I think I let you guys know up front that I had to get off of this Zoom call at about 6:30 because I had another pre-planned call. But I'd like to say thank you for hosting the police department on this call and allowing us to talk to the community and answer some of their questions. Unfortunately, I have to take off, but I hope the questions that I've tried to answer or the comments I've made have been helpful. If anyone wants to contact me personally or in the police department and ask associated questions, they can contact me at area code 626-744-4533. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that I can't answer. But again, thank you for hosting this for us. And thank you for all the community members who are there and asking questions.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Deputy Chief, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for participating in our program. We do appreciate your time and understand that you have to go.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, so far we have touched on the problems that COVID is presenting, and of course now the recent fires, which have all problems of their own. But we would be remiss if we didn't touch on the elephant in the room, and that is the recent social protesting. How is that affecting the police department? Certainly, not only must it cause you to reevaluate policies, but it also has to be devastating to morale. I'm wondering if you all would take a moment to discuss that.
And I'll let the staff get into answering that how they wish. But, it's been quite the journey at the beginning. There's not one of us that doesn't believe in the social movement. The greatest changes in this country have come about through social change. And we belong to a profession that constantly is searching to change to become better. But we also realize with the dynamics that we have, it's not as simple as people would like. Over the last year, we have reorganized a department to get at some of those changes prior to the social movement beginning and the death of Mr. Floyd. It's been something that was dear to our hearts to change the police department as we got rid of the gang unit. We eliminated our gang unit back in February as part of our major reorganization. Since then, we've actually seen violence and shootings almost double. So we're challenged here with trying to become a better police department and reducing the type of enforcement that have made people uncomfortable over the decades and decades of trying to reduce violence. So we become this experiment. At the beginning, we had probably 30 or 40 protests in our city. We supported each and every one of them. We've worked with the organizers. We've built some great relationships. We were not really looking to be seen or heard during these protests, and they worked out perfectly fine with some challenges here and there. As we got closer to it, we were dragged into this arena of the national concerns on policing with our own officer-involved shooting. And a lot of criticisms from the community at this point about that incident. And I'm really limited in what I could talk about at this point, but all the information was put out instantly within a few hours after the event happened. We put out all the video, both our video press release and all the raw data. And we also ensured that our coroner's report didn't have a hold on it. And usually that's something police departments do. So we've been extraordinarily, transparent, but that doesn't help this process. And at this point, we are concerned about what's happened in Los Angeles with 2 sheriff deputies who, in fact, were ambushed and were near death. So we're in a place where our thoughts and our prayers have gone out to the McLean family for the loss and their family for what has happened, as well as knowing that we have challenges for the safety of police officers right now all over the country, and especially here in Los Angeles. As police officers are ambushed or attacked, it places the greater percentage of our society into harm's way of trouble. It means that there's not that kind of protection. If you can't depend on the police to protect you, what happens next? We do know that 28% increase has occurred this year in the deaths, the murders of police officers. So we're challenged with both ends of this, of trying to find our challenges and how we're going to approach this. For now, it is my job as the chief of police, as we've seen our violence increase this past weekend with a number of car-to-car shootings, the shooting of 2 young people, the overdose of 8 people, and the death of 3 of those as well. We were just hit hard with tragedies around every corner this weekend. And so we as a police department have to ensure that we enforce the law, but do our best to ensure that it's being done with the best interest of all people. That is not always simple in a moment of crisis on both ends with police officers and people in our community who might be carrying guns. We have 200 guns that have been seized this year. We have another 60 or 70 have been seized by our special task forces around the region. This is way too many handguns at a time that we're protesting and we're having social movement and vigils to know there's so many guns. So we have to find a balance here in what we're doing. And as a chief of police, I owe it to this community to make sure it's being done correctly and with compassion and care while understanding the violent part of what's been happening. And anybody else that wants to add anything to that, please do.
Chief, if I may, thank you. I think what's important to note here is the successful job we've done at handling these protests. When you look at all the protests throughout the country and whether they be peaceful demonstrations or civil unrest, our approach to the protests here in Pasadena, and like the chief said, we've had 30 to 40 of them, has been above board and has been done right, I believe. As for resources, it is taxing on our resources because we have to make sure that we have enough resources available to respond accordingly, that if a peaceful protest or demonstration turns into civil unrest. So we do have those resources available to us. But we also, as the chief mentioned, provide support and make sure that people can exercise their First Amendment rights, which everybody and every U.S. citizen, whether Pasadena or anywhere else, has the right to do. And that's important for us. And, we work on not engaging if we don't have to engage. And we've been fortunate enough not to have to, as well as de-escalation techniques, which we've been doing for several years now, which has assisted us tremendously in our effort to police the community.
And since July, we've been tracking our de-escalations, and we probably have a few hundred examples of de-escalation. This past weekend, we had a man with a gun inside of a park waving it, and we were able to gain cooperation. So at times it does work for us, and other times it doesn't. And so we really try to aim for gaining the cooperation, so people understand, that it's safer to tell us you have a gun, safer you tell us it's on the waistband or inside of the car. And we've had many, many incidents where the guns were removed directly from people's waistbands. And that's a part of police work that gets very dangerous, and most people wouldn't begin to understand of what it takes to really try to stop violence. We're always better to prevent violence. We're always better to have initiatives in the community to get young people to understand, don't do this. When that fails us and prevention, intervention don't do it, we are stuck with the enforcement aspect of trying to stop violence. And that's never good for any community anywhere. It's not, police officers do not want to be involved in officer-involved shootings ever. And so these are some of the dynamics that we have today. We have to be an example to the rest of the country. Now that we've had our own incident happen, and we look at other cities from Portland to Seattle to what's happening in Wisconsin, Minneapolis, we could be an example to the rest of the country in a way that it doesn't have to go into occupying city halls and burning down some buildings and having more violence on top of violence. We could be that community that comes and tries to find solutions to these socioeconomic issues that have been happening for decades in Pasadena.
Well, I realize this next question may have been partially answered by your previous response here. As far as the social protests are concerned, certainly everyone is aware that there have been charges of racism within police departments. But a larger percentage of the protesters argue that the role of policing has switched to something more like enforcers and less like guardians. My question to you all is, do you feel that that's a fair characterization?
That's a true concern people have, because if you look at our nightly news and we look at other aspects of policing, you're not seeing the prevention or the intervention that we've conducted. You're just seeing the outcome of the news on the enforcement. And when you look at the fact there's 1,000 officer-involved shootings across this country every year, it may be a small dynamic of the millions and millions of calls for service that police officers go on. It doesn't matter if there's one on the news. It does bother us. We had ours here in Pasadena, and over the years, we've had engagements that have not gone well for our community. It's very uncomfortable for us to see any violence whatsoever. We prefer to do prevention, intervention, and not have to enforce. So I believe that the concern from the public, on one end, from people who have lived in communities for decades, where they see the police trying to stop violence. Pasadena has had a history of violence over the decades. We used to have double-digit murders every year, with more than half being youth-aged individuals. So we stopped some of that violence in the 80s and 90s and 2000s by prevention and intervention. However, part of that was also the enforcement, and that caused the incarceration rates to increase dramatically. We're responsible for that. We're also responsible for how we do policing. But we realize, where do you stop this? We are the example, or we are the experiment for society to sit down and figure this out scientifically. We have to understand how much prevention can we do to try to stop the violence before it occurs. At this time, my years in this department, for 35 years, I have not seen many people out in the street trying to do prevention, intervention, but the police department. Some say that's not your role. I get that. But over the decades, this has become our role. In the 80s, we were devastated by the gang and crack epidemic. The 90s, especially after the riots, for those of us that were here, we saw the greatest change in policing ever during that period of time. And then we had 9/11 come in with the Patriot Act, and we were concerned about terrorism, and an active shooter came up, and that started to change a lot of the policing that was happening. People wanted to be protected. So here we are trying to create this prevention for outreach for youth and being in the schools. And now we moved into an arena where we're very concerned about the outcome. Many of these happen from traffic stops. As I explain to people when I can, there are two parts of those devastating traffic stops. One is the actual traffic stop itself, and the second part is the incident that comes from that traffic stop. If people cooperated on both sides of a driver or the passengers and the police, we have complete cooperation. As we get most of the time, people do tell us, there are guns in my car. There is a gun on my waistband. We're able to work through those problems. But when there's fear on both sides, this is the outcome as we've seen, which is devastating for our community.
All right.
And I'll just add that, I think part of my job is building relationships to influence and inspire, both inside the department and externally in the community. I think that, we all have to have a level of competency and character because every day we're using common sense, logical analysis, and a true concern for people because we want neighborhoods to be safe. There's nothing more than having people being held hostage in their neighborhood by people that are doing, bad deeds on the street. And we have to find a balance, like the chief said. We're students of our profession. We see what works. We see what doesn't work. We've looked at past injustices. We have that guardian mindset. We try to show transparency as much as the law allows us to. We collaborate, not just internally, but with other police agencies and with community-based organizations. I actually am the project director of a $2.5 million grant awarded by the state of California that, the main focus is on persons returning from state prison. So these previously incarcerated members of our community are returning to Pasadena, and there's something that they can go and do and get tangible help through financial literacy, housing assistance, job skill training. There's a multitude of connections that we help them with to prevent them from returning to prison. So I think that balance of, sometimes people only see police in three ways: that you're speeding down the street, that you were a victim of a crime, or we think you did something. And none of those on its face value are good. And, how do we get into people's houses at 3 a.m. who are in a domestic dispute? We're called there. We just can't walk through the neighborhood as their house, as the chief says, to check up and say, hey, is everybody doing good? Anybody want to report anything? So we try to find that balance. And sometimes we have to be proactive, but sometimes we're also reactive when crime is occurring and or calls of service are coming into our dispatch center. So again, we find that balance almost in everything that we try to do. It's not like television where things are held up or 45 minutes later, crimes are solved. Some of these things take.
I'm afraid we lost your audio there. Your mic seemed to get muted at the very end.
I pushed the button. So yeah, sometimes it takes time to solve community problems, and we're there to keep the balance.
Sometimes I have to mute Commander Clausen, but this wasn't one of those times.
Well, to our viewers at home, I'd like to remind everyone, of course, obviously because of the social distancing, we continue to do our programs remotely. And so everyone is in a different location, and we're all using computer systems, and sometimes these little glitches occur. So we certainly apologize for that, and we'll do everything we can to make sure we get all the information across. As we were speaking earlier, of course, we have noted that there does seem to be a distressing rise in violence recently, and especially in gun violence. As you have noted, there were the youths that were shot in the park recently. Over the weekend, there was a car-to-car shooting that resulted in a death along the 210 freeway in the San Bernardino area. And of course, there has been the recent ambush of the 2 sheriff's deputies who were actually not actively involved in any part of monitoring any protest. They were simply sitting in their patrol car protecting a train station. Does that affect the police at large? Certainly that must cause a sense of concern, because anyone bold enough to run up and attack police officers would pose an even greater threat to the average unarmed citizen. And certainly there are concerns for your own personal safety. Are you also concerned about copycats?
Absolutely, we're concerned about copycats. And this incident was just devastating, horrific. to everybody in the community. Like I said, our hearts go out to these deputies that were heroic in what they were doing and trying to survive the shooting itself and the aftermath at the hospital, people trying to make entry and trying to push them out who wanted the deputies to die. It's just terrible for our entire community if we are shifting to that type of environment. Everybody is in arm's way of danger, and we should all be concerned. Our police officers are concerned. They have to balance that fear with their daily police work to ensure they're doing it right. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have that people may miss is that they are human beings with families. One of the deputies is a mother with a 6-year-old. We are families, we are fathers, we are neighbors, we are brothers and sisters. And so we have tried to make this change from the inside out, and it's not simple. So the police officers do have fear, and these police officers have to balance that fear with the everyday close to 400 calls for service we receive, that a lot of them start with aggression, with a threat, with a fight, a possible weapon. They might not end that way, but our response there, we have to think about all these different type of scenarios that might come up while we're there. Over the years, we've seen a fantastic drop in officer deaths across this country because of the training we have. And people consider that too much military training and too much tactics, but that's what's kept us alive to ensure that we're able to survive these type of incidents. She was able to use a tourniquet to save her partner's life. These are things that people don't think about in regular daily experiences if we are involved in some kind of incident like this. So it's been horrific. We've talked about it internally. Our officers are deeply concerned, and we are prepared for anything like this. However, trying to keep your head on a swivel and watching all sides at all time while trying not to push that fear to people around us in the public. How do we do that? And I think they're doing a great job of understanding that challenge they have.
Well, that brings me to another question. And again, you were talking about things the general public doesn't generally consider. What about the mental stress that this puts on every officer in every department across the country? And moreover, the mental stress for those officers' families?
I'll let Commander Shute talk a little bit about this one, but I will say that I do talk to many of the family members. We do have a peer counseling team here in the station that does reach out to our personnel, but we try to keep in contact with our police officers, with the family members, and we do hear the stress. We do hear the concerns. They worry about the communities supporting their significant others here at the police department. It's good when we hear council members supporting and community supporting the police department. It helps our family members. With social media, they're tracking it every day. They're watching it. They're looking at the messages coming out. They wonder if that city that they're in, their family members are in, is in a safe place. So I'll let Commander Shute and the others talk to this one. I'm going to step away. I do have Council Member Gordo waiting for me on another Zoom with community members regarding the shooting at Villa Park. So I will step away, but you're in good hands here in the last 10 minutes as we go forward. I thank you again.
Chief Perez, again, we also thank you for your participation this evening and for allowing your department to participate in tonight's show. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe.
Thank you, Chief. As the Chief had mentioned, this does get stressful for our officers. You talk about us moving from guardians to warriors, or guardians to, what was the exact word that you used? I don't want to misquote you.
The question... You're referring to what the question was?
You mentioned it a little earlier, the Guardian versus...
that some of the protesters argue that policing has moved away from being guardians and becoming more like enforcers.
Yeah, so you mentioned that, and we do see ourselves as guardians of the community. We do see ourselves as the protectors and not the enforcers, unless we do have to take enforcement. Like the Chief mentioned, prevention, intervention, and enforcement is the last piece that we take. But when you get an unprovoked attack on two deputies or sitting in a vehicle protecting a bus terminal and the Gold Line, that worries us, and that worries our family. And our family wants us to go home as much as community members want to be able to be in their community and interact on the streets and walk down the street safely and get home to their family members. Our officers do as well. So it is very important that we take care of our officers, and our officers do an outstanding job. They really do. And they work very hard at at de-escalating and not engaging and being the guardians. But they do have to protect themselves, and we have to help protect them from those unprovoked attacks and those attacks on law enforcement that you don't expect and that people don't believe happen, but they do. That just happened to be caught on video, and a lot of times we do get attacked and people don't see it. They just see the aftermath. But yeah, it is very important. And I'll let Commander Goodman talk a little bit more about what we do as far as mental health in the police department.
Thanks, Art. So Joe, we do have what I like to refer to as a culture of wellness here at the Pasadena Police Department. You'll hear quite often in law enforcement having welfare programs or wellness programs within a police department. But I don't think that's broad enough. I think that wellness needs to be approached from a cultural standpoint from within the organization. And so it has everything to do with how we interact with one another in the building, and then also specific programs that we have for our personnel, whether it be debriefing a critical incident, whether it be handling crisis in one of our officers' personal lives, whether it be a comprehensive peer support and counseling network that we have built within the police department, whether it's training those officers that are in that unit on how to best deal with the issues that appear with their peers or perhaps those around them. It's building a culture that says it's okay to not be okay, and then to seek the help you need in order to keep the morale of our organization high in what can arguably be considered one of the most challenging times in law enforcement. Our officers rise to the occasion day in and day out. That has a lot to do with the type of people that we hire. We hire some of the best people in the industry. It also has to do a lot with the training. We have some of the best training in the industry, not only from a field perspective, but also from a perspective of teaching how to de-escalate, how to effectively communicate with people, how to explain to people why perhaps they were stopped by law enforcement. And then to complete the circle in a holistic manner is to have an open culture here at the police department that encourages us to go to one another when we're not quite having that great of a day, so that we can get to where we need to be so that we can effectively serve the community around us.
All right. Before we go any further, we only have a few minutes left, and we do actually have a question from one of our viewers. This comes to us from Dan. He was hoping that you could take a moment to speak about the HOPE team and what they do.
I'll take that. In fact, I supervise that team. The HOPE team is a homeless outreach and psychological evaluation team where we have officers that are actually teamed up with Department of Mental Health social workers that will go out into the field and connect with people who may be suffering from a mental health crisis or maybe committing crimes because of drugs and mental health issues. Sometimes they're dealing with homeless people who are down on their luck, living on the sides of the freeways. And what they try to do is and we've done some experiments here within the department where we've taken these officers out of uniform and put them in plain clothes where they can go out and contact these people. It's all about really how you feel, your comfort level, and having us, we're not interested in arresting you. We want to provide services. One of our issues is that there's many people that are service resistant, that they know where they can go get help, yet they don't want to stop their drug use. They don't want to stop their alcohol. But again, we, the police, we are one conduit of a handoff. And we don't do handoffs very well sometimes because of the call for service level where we would get information and we'll give a phone number or a information card, and the person's never going to show up there versus physically taking them to a facility, introducing them to a case manager or a social worker to help them get back on their track. And just recently, we've also partnered with Union Station, who now has a worker teamed up with one of our HOPE team members to get people into deeper services. So again, there's that balance out there that we're trying to find. We're not just trying to arrest everybody we come into contact with. We're trying to guide, navigate, and help people get back on their feet, and especially in this trying time when people are out of work, are battling everything from COVID-19 to the fires. So again, it's a balance that we look for every day when we're out, policing our community.
All right. Well, with the very few minutes we have left, and I'm sorry that we are already running so short of time, this one last question. Recently, the City Council unanimously passed a motion that would form a community oversight committee. I'm wondering if the department has any thoughts about that.
I'll talk a little bit about it. We support it. Let people come in and let them see what we're doing, and they will see that we're doing things right most of the time. If people want to come in and see how we investigate, we're open to all that. We can provide people, and right now everything's provided online, our policies and procedures, that if somebody wants to know how what our policy is towards any issue that we may come across, it's all online at the city's website under the police department. So, once the city council, once the city figures out how that mechanism is going to come into play, we're going to support it 100%. Let's see what they have for us, and we'll navigate. Just like it's kind of like a case law decision. When the law changes in Sacramento or across the United States, we're going to adopt to it. We're going to train to it. We're going to change our business practice. So we're open to it. We welcome it.
And has the department looked into or implemented any changes in the wake of the George Floyd incident?
Or did you want to talk about the carotid restraint, some of our field operations in relation to that?
We only have a minute and a half left. I'm sorry.
I'll give a quick overview. Right after that incident took place, our police department was one of the first, probably in the state of California, to implement suspension of the use of the carotid restraint, which is designed to render a combative subject unconscious. So that's an affirmative step that we took early on. We have for years been very progressive in the training of our personnel and staying ahead of social issues that impact law enforcement. And I think it's great that we're progressive and that we're innovative in those ways. And I echo Commander Clausen. I absolutely invite anybody who's interested in seeing how our operations progress day to day, week to week, month to month, or year to year to come on in and see what we do. And we're more than happy to show you how law enforcement's done on a daily basis.
Well, that unfortunately brings us to the close of our show. We apologize for not having more time. Obviously, there are so many more questions we wanted to get to, and there's such a wealth of information that the community would really benefit from. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Commanders Clausen, Goodman, and Shute, Acting Executive Administrator Michelle Robinson, Lieutenant Bill Brisafe. I apologize. I always stumble over that name, but I didn't want to get it wrong. And of course, Chief John Perez and Deputy Chief Cheryl Moody, thank you all so much for being with us this evening. We truly do appreciate your taking the time to talk to us and share with the community. To our viewers at home, if there are topics you would like to see addressed in our discussions, you can email them to us at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org, and we may include them in a future broadcast. Until then, this has been Arroyo Live. I'm Joe Carbonetta. Thanks for watching, and have a great night.